show you guys how to solve the complete columnar cipher, and it's found in Science Olympiad Codebusters Division B. I did make a video on this previously, but the audio wasn't working after a certain time mark, so I decided to make an updated version, and this version I will go over a harder example than the first one. So over here I have a process guide which shows how to solve any type of complete columnar cipher. So the green represents easy, and the yellow represents intermediate, and the red represents hard. So first let's go over easy. Something you have to do in every complete columnar cipher is to count the number of letters in the ciphertext. So you'll see a text that is like a line and then after a line. You have to count all of that, and we will go over that, and usually you count that in groups of 2. So after you count the number of letters, if the easy has the keyword in it, so intermediate and hard has no keyword, but easy always has a keyword, and by keyword, it's not like an aristocrat keyword, it's like a hint that is given, for example, saying keyword is somewhere in this text, and then you go based on that. So if the keyword is life, and life has 4 letters inside of it, right? So you would add +1 to that keyword. So you would just add a number to that keyword, meaning so if it's 4 letters in life, then that would become 5. And then that gives you your column number. And then you would divide the column number by the total number of letters in the ciphertext to get your row number. And then this is for easy and intermediate, so rearrange the columns lettering to create a segment of words, letters that make sense as a quote or a sentence. So now let's move on to intermediate. Again, you count the total number of letters in the ciphertext, and this time you don't have a keyword, but the ciphertext does contain the letter X. And basically you can calculate spacing on this. So for example, if X comes after 6 letters in the ciphertext, then you would know the spacing is 6, so that means it's 6 rows. And then you can identify the number of columns based on that by dividing the number of rows. And then again, rearrange the columns lettering to create a segment of words, letters that make sense as a quote or sentence. Now moving on to hard, the step for everything, so count the total number of letters, and then this time you don't have a keyword and you have no X, so it's really trial and error at this point, and so trial and error with the number of letters and array probabilities. So basically how you could do this is if the total number of the ciphertext letter is 48, so then you would list all the multiples to multiply to 48, and a tip is the closest numbers together. So for example, we have 6 and 8, but with 48 you can also do 2 times 24. But most likely the table will be arranged with the numbers that are closest together. So it would be 6 and 8, or either 8 and 6, etc. Another thing to note is that the reason we add +1 is because in the Codebusters rule manual, that it needs to be 1 less than the columns used, which goes out to be 1 more than the crib. Now let's look at the steps to solve a complete columnar. So step 1, count the total number of letters in the ciphertext. We already went over this in the process guide above. Step 2, count the number of letters in the keyword and add 1 to that number for the number of columns. So this again only applies to easy and does not apply to intermediate or hard. Step 3, divide the total number of letters in the ciphertext by the number of columns to get the number of rows. Split the ciphertext into groups of the row number. So basically what this means is there is the row number and the column letter number. So that means that if the ciphertext is like this, then you would just divide it into groups, and the groups of those are what you would use in the next steps. So step 4, try to descramble the starting letters of each group. So for example, if the starting letter of this group is B, then you would take this starting letter and then the next starting letter of every group and go on and try to descramble that into some word or phrase that makes sense. And then step 5 is to once the unscrambled word makes sense. And then to check that, write the second letter below of the starting letter of the word and see if it makes sense. So what this means is that if we have the starting letters as, for example, be, my, and then we would go on and either it would make sense if we go like be my best and go on. So these over here, we read it in a zigzag order. So we don't read it like up and down or another way, but zigzag. So we go from be my and then to be best or something, whatever comes after the second. So it's like over here we have this group, right? So this group is the B over here, and then we would have another B, and then that would make sense. So it just has to make sense. This like top first letters does not have to be a complete word or like phrase. It just has to make sense if you put the second letters and then if that makes like a word or a phrase. And then continue on from step 5, write the following letters of the group below the first letter. So the entire like cipher words over here, you would just write underneath vertically. Step 6 is keep going until the end, and then again, remember to read in a zigzag order. I know this might be a lot to grasp at first, but we will go over 2 examples, so it will make a lot more sense once we complete them. Okay, so this is an example that is beginner because it has a keyword. So we're told that IFE that is somewhere in the cipher. So the first step, we would count the total number of ciphertext letters. So 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60, and 64. So we would write that on the side to use that later. Now we can count the total number of letters in the keyword. So it is 3 plus 4, so 7, and then we would add plus 1, right? Because due to the Codebusters manual, again, this only works in Codebusters, so it might not work in every cipher, but if you're doing it for Codebusters, it should work. And so that means 8, so we would divide 64 by 8, which is 8. So over here, our column number and our row number is the same, but that's not always true. So this is the column number and this is the row number. Since we got our row number, we would divide the ciphertext into groups of 8. So first we have our 5 and then a 3, and then I'll continue dividing it into groups. So it is correctly divided into groups of 8, and now what we would do is try to descramble the starting letters. So first, our first starting letter would be T, and then next E, and we would just keep going like this. So I, and then A, and then B, and then S, and then E, and then H. So these are all of our starting letters, and now we can try to descramble it. So the first thought that comes into my mind is something like the. Maybe it could start with that. And again, it's more of a guess and check. You're not for sure. So there is different possibilities that it can be. So this is my guess, and we can see if it's correct or not. So the base I and then blank. So first, how to check that is we have M as the second letter of this first starting letter. And again, as you can see, we went in order, right? So T-E-I. It does not matter when you're trying to descramble it. So whatever is a starting letter, so the first letter, then you just keep going based on that. So don't really mind the order of where I write it. And then after, to check, we only do the second letter. We don't need to write the whole column first. So H is Y, and then there are 2 E's in this case. So either E-L or E-O, and so basically usually it is the first E will always be the first one used in the descrambled word, but that can change, so just keep an eye out for that. So don't always be like based on the rules. It can change if it doesn't make sense. So in this case, I'm gonna go for O, the second one, because I think it could be like I'm you or something that makes sense like that. And then so B is I, and then A is P, and then S is H, and then E is, so this is the first E actually, and what I mean by first and second is just in what order it comes in the ciphertext. So this E would be L, and then I would be N, and this doesn't seem to make much sense. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think we can cross out this idea of the base I. And then also over here we do have two E's is something that you can mark. You can just acknowledge it. You don't necessarily have to be too much worried about it. So now we can try a different possibility. And something I had in mind was it has and then BEE. So maybe we can try it and see if that works. The reason I chose this option is because if this option is correct, then it would be something like it has been, so with the N over here. And I thought of this idea, first of all, choosing the I and then the T, and then I saw the H, A, S, and then I just tried to piece together the BEE. As you can see over here, I did not put these two in order, so whatever makes sense first, and I would just write it off to the side if it doesn't make sense. So the next letter in I, which I'm taking over here, is N, and then of course since we're checking, we only go for the second letter. So then for T, it is M. So far, I think it makes sense, and then H is Y, and then A is P, and then S is H, and then B is I. So now we came to the E part. So I'm thinking we can try the first E and see if that works, and if it doesn't, we can just come back. So then this E would be O. And so far this makes sense. Maybe it could be something like it has been my philosophy. So let's continue by writing the first column together, and then so S, I, another two I's. You can see I'm just writing vertically, so you write it vertically once you got the correct answer, and then you don't have to keep going in like a zigzag order. So let's do T together. So it would be O, and then F, and then F again, E, and then W, and D. So here's the final answer. It says, it has been my philosophy of life that difficulties vanish when faced boldly. There's the final answer, and now let's move on to harder cipher. Okay, so the reason this one is a little bit harder is because it does not have a keyword, but it is intermediate because it does have an X. So we don't have any keywords, so what I would do first is to find out like the spacing. Of course, we can count the total number of letters, which is 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, and 48. So we can write that on the side as normal. And this time, calculating the spacing by the X. So we can see that the first X appears in the 6th space, and then we would go another 6 spaces. And of course, I'm doing this just to check and just to check. So we would put another one after 6 spaces, and then if this X, the next X appears after 6 spaces again, that means we are correct, and it does. So that means the row is 6 spaces. So then we can just go another 6, and then another 6. And if you remember last time, since we have a keyword, we would divide the keyword number, which is the column number, by the total number to get the row number. But in this case, we find the row number first. So it's not like this number is always going to be the column or the row. It just depends on what you're finding first. So we know that the column number is 8. Now we can the starting letters. So something to note that since we know that X is really helpful in complete columnar ciphers, we have an X over here due to the intermediate level with no keyword, right? So whenever there is a group that does not end with the X, that means the starting letter of that group would be towards the beginning. And again, this is just a rule. It is not always true, but it usually is. So letters that don't have a X at the end would be R, E, and then one of the A's. So those three are the ones without X at the end. So we usually have to try to create these three R, E, A at the beginning. So let's try something like R and see if that would work. So I don't think this makes sense. R drams. So that's what I meant before, that the rules don't always have to be true, but they usually are just a guideline. You don't have to strictly follow them. They're just hints to help you. So something that we could learn instead of this R in the beginning, I was thinking dreams. Maybe that could make sense. I think dreams make sense if we result in an A as the second letter of the D group. So as we can see, D does have an E after it, so I think this does make sense. And what I would just do to check is go through the rest. So there is a G over here, and then an A after this E. Again, there are two R's and two A's, so basically I am just using the first one, and if that works, then great, and if that doesn't, then we can try a different combination. So this is the first A, has a T, and then M is E, and then S is W, and then the second A is A. So far I think this makes sense, so we don't need to be switching up the A's and the R's. And then the second R is a Y. So what I'll do now is just complete the entire table. So our answer would be dreams are gateways to other universes and galaxies. Another thing to note is that we have 4 X's over here, so all that means is the phrase or sentence just ends a little shorter. I hope this video was helpful for you guys, and if you have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to me in the comments. Thank you for watching.